I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Matt Kuras. Matt is a distinguished community development specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. He carries out the Wisconsin idea by assisting communities and organizations through economic development, policy evaluation, labor force research, and regional competitiveness analysis. Matt's worked at the University of Wisconsin since 2001. During his time, he has authored numerous studies on Wisconsin's economy and made frequent presentations to local, regional, and national audiences. Matt was a regular contributor to the Capital Region Business Journal, and his work is featured in numerous other business and economic development publications. Matt was also named to Madison's 40 Under 40 by In Business Magazine. In 2016, he received the Outstanding Specialist Award from UW Extension's Community Natural Resource and Economic Development Program. Matt has a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'd ask that you please welcome our keynote speaker today, Matt Kuras. Matt?
Great, thank you for that very nice introduction, Jeff, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you talking a bit about what Wisconsin's labor market will look like in a post-pandemic world, hopefully a post-pandemic world soon enough, and what that might mean specifically for youth in our region. So there's a lot we could unpack today, particularly discussing how our economy's changed given the pandemic, but I just have about a half hour with you this morning, so I want to highlight a few trends that I see as being important for our labor market going forward and what it might mean in terms of how we engage youth and how we encourage them to be a strong part of our labor force going forward. So just some historical perspective, thinking about participation rates in the labor force back to 1976 up to the most recent data we have for 2020, and these are annual average participation rates. And just as a reminder, participation rates mean that these are individuals of a given age group that are either directly working in a job or unemployed and actively seeking employment. So again, this does not include individuals who are out of the labor force due to a whole host of reasons. Maybe it's due to school attendance, maybe it's due to retirement, maybe it's due to childcare demands, and many other reasons to think about that might keep people out of the labor force. A couple things to keep in mind here is that both the state of Wisconsin and the United States saw very strong participation rate growth throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And this was primarily due to women entering the labor force in very large numbers, and also baby boomers reaching their prime working ages. And we can see really since the turn of the century, participation rates have started to trend downwards in both the state of Wisconsin and the United States. And this has been of concern to a lot of employers, to a lot of labor market economists. And there are some concerns here that we need to take into account, but there's also some very good reasons why these participation rates are trending downward. One thing to keep in mind though, as we look at these numbers, almost every single measure we look at in terms of participation rates by different age groups, by different demographic segments, the state of Wisconsin is almost always higher than the US average. If we look at participation rates among individual age groups for the state of Wisconsin compared to the US, we can see that individuals aged 16 to 19 have also trended downwards in the state of Wisconsin, going from about 67% back in the year 2000 to about 52% right now. There's good reasons for this as well. One of the reasons that we see participation rates go down is that the dropout rate has declined among our youth. It used to be that if you dropped out of high school, you went and got a job because you could. And now we're seeing dropout rates declining, so people are not going to the labor force in this age group as much. We're also seeing a higher emphasis on academic outcomes, so many parents are not encouraging their children to get jobs like they used to, and encouraging them to attend school and extracurricular activities full time. We also see downward rates with ages 20 to 24, and a lot of this has to do with increased enrollments in higher educational institutions. Now, these are our prime working age individuals between the ages of 25 to 54. This is when people are most likely to be actively in the labor force. Again, we see the state of Wisconsin is higher for both men and women. We see that men have a higher participation rates for women, and we'll come back to this in a little bit going forward and what this might mean for our labor force in the next decade or so. And we can also see that, again, rates have trended downward somewhat for all of these groups. And again, there's some good reasons for this, but nonetheless, there are opportunities here to increase participation rates among prime working age individuals to help boost the number of individuals in the labor force. A very important trend for the state of Wisconsin are increasing participation rates among individuals age 55 to 64 and age 65 and older. These are the two age groups where participation rates have actually increased. A lot of this has to do with the impacts of the Great Recession. People had to stay in the labor force longer because the retirement savings were knocked down, but it's also a desire to work. Individuals that may be age 55 to 64 or 65 and older may simply want to be part of an industry, part of a job, part of an employer to have opportunities for social interaction, to contribute, to earn additional money. So this isn't necessarily just due to economic circumstances, but also due to the desire of people wanting to perhaps work longer. And when we look at the demographic structure of the state of Wisconsin, this is important. These are participation rates by age group within South Central Wisconsin. And this is a bit of a messy chart, and I'll make sure that you have copies of these slides going forward so you don't have to sit and analyze all these numbers. Long story short, what we see here is, again, if we look at the state of Wisconsin for these different age groups, they are traditionally higher than the national average with the exception of age 65 and older. And if we look at counties in South Central Wisconsin, they are higher than the state average and higher than the national average for the most part as well. We see very high participation rates among ages 25 to 54 and almost all counties in South Central Wisconsin. Those where we see a bit lower participation rates among this age group are unfortunately due to incarcerated populations. There are a number of correctional institutions in several of these counties that do push down participation rates among these age groups. So just something to keep in mind. Now, we have certainly seen the pandemic change participation rates, and we could go into this a lot more in terms of different demographic segments, but to keep in mind some impacts on different age groups. We can see that in almost every age group, if we go back to the month prior to the beginning of the pandemic, so February of 2020, we can see that almost every single age group has yet to return to participation rates prior to the pandemic. And in some instances, they're quite a bit lower. The exception being ages 16 to 19. We do see that participation rates among our youth have pretty much rebounded to where they were prior to the pandemic. The other big trend we see here is that despite what we saw with increasing participation rates among older individuals prior to the pandemic, we see them declining quite a bit now. And again, that may be due to the fact that individuals are retiring early instead of what we saw prior to the pandemic. And again, when we look at our age structure for the state of Wisconsin, this is important if this trend holds. If we look at change in employment by industry, these are seasonally adjusted numbers. So going back to the month prior to the start of the pandemic to the most recent numbers we have now, we can see the changes by different industry sector. No big surprise, the two industries on a percentage basis that were hit the hardest were accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment, and recreation. A couple of industries actually grew employment over this time, but for the most part, we do see minor decreases in employment across almost every single industry sector. But the good news is that most industries have almost rebounded to their prior employment levels prior to the pandemic, excuse me. Again, very large numbers lost in accommodation and food services. Government is still down about 29,000 jobs. Part of this is due to education. Healthcare and social assistance is still down quite a bit. Manufacturing is still down about 5,000 jobs, and minor losses in other industries as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we look at those declining numbers and employment levels that have not quite reached pre-pandemic employment levels, we do have to keep in mind that there are still individuals out of the labor force that probably could be in the labor force. And I do know that a number of employers and workforce development organizations and economic development groups have pointed to the extended benefits, enhanced benefits for unemployment that is maybe keeping people out of the labor force. And this very well may be for a number of individuals. In fact, if we look at weekly and initial claims for unemployment insurance filings, we can see that if we look at these are week 31 numbers that you see on the chart. So we're comparing the same week in 2021 to the same week in 2020 to the same week in 2019. That in 2021 compared to 2019 numbers, yeah, we're about double where we were before. But if we look at the state of Wisconsin, that's only about 26,000 additional individuals that may be out of work compared to the number of individuals in the year 2019. So even if all those individuals are on the sideline due to enhanced benefits and they came back in the labor force, and we still think about how the state of Wisconsin's down about 126,000 jobs total non-farm employment between the start of the pandemic and where we are now. If those individuals all went back in the labor force, they still would not account for the number of lost jobs that we have now. These are just some perspectives on South Central Wisconsin counties. These are filings for week 31. And again, if we look across all of the counties in South Central Wisconsin, if we look at weekly claims and initial claims, yeah, they're about double where they were in the same week of 2019. So again, there are some opportunities here to increase the number of individuals who are on unemployment into the labor force. But this is not going to be enough to meet labor force demands. And I will argue, and I'm sure employers that are on the presentation this morning will back this up, is that our labor force issues and our supply issues started well before the pandemic. So if we look at participation rates, again, this chart before, and we look at the declines since the year 2000, one of the primary reasons we're seeing these declines is simply the aging of our population. If we look at the percent change in individuals age 55 to 64, they have increased by over 80%, or about 80%, excuse me. We think about participation rates among this age group being about 10 to 20% lower than prime working age individuals. It's not surprising that the overall participation rate drops. If we look at individuals age 65 and older, increasing by 40%, and thinking about their participation rates of being about 60% lower than prime working age individuals, it's going to depress our overall participation rate in the state of Wisconsin. So a lot of the issues we're seeing now and going forward and prior to the pandemic were structural due to our age distribution. And even if we increased our overall participation rate among individuals aged 25 to 54 to where it was in 2000, which was about 3 percentage points higher than it was now, we would still be down over 100,000 prime working age individuals in the state of Wisconsin. If we increase participation rates, would it help this number? Yeah, absolutely. But again, our overall age structure is depressing the number of prime and overall total working age population in the state of Wisconsin. And this is just a perspective county by county, changes in total working age and prime working age population from 2010 to 2019. We can see that in terms of total working age population, those individuals aged 15 to 64, we can see that only 8 counties in the state of Wisconsin actually increased in the total working age population. These were primarily border counties or counties that had a 4-year UW institution. We only had 2 counties in the state of Wisconsin that had an increase in prime working age population, and those were Dane and Eau Claire. And again, especially in northern Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, we can see significant declines in individuals between the age of 25 to 54. I would like to say that this age structure issue is not going to affect us going forward, but it will. This is a projected change in population age 65 and older, starting back at the 2010 census and stepping forward to projections in the year 2040. If we look at the year 2010, we can see there are only 2 counties in the state of Wisconsin that had 25% of their population age 65 or older. If we step forward to the year 2015, we can see this increase to 6. By 2020, where we just were, we see 15 counties. By the year 2025, so just 4 years away, we see 30 counties. By the year 2030, we see 38 counties. By the year 2035, we see 43 counties. And by 2040, we see 45 counties in the state of Wisconsin with at least 25% of their population age 65 and older. So again, this is going to have many ramifications for labor availability, but it will also change the nature of the types of demands needed by local residents. It'll increase the demand for healthcare. It'll change transportation needs. It'll increase or change our tax structure and tax collections. So again, this isn't just about what it means for our labor force, but this will have very large ramifications for our economy going forward. And there are no counties in the state of Wisconsin that will not experience some sort of change due to the shifting demographics. If we look at counties in South Central Wisconsin, again, from 2010 just to 2030 in this instance, we can see that the numbers in many counties will not quite double, but come pretty close to doubling in terms of the share of the population age 65 and older. We can see in Marquette County that it'll be almost 36% in just the next decade. So a very high share of individuals age 65 or older. And even in Dane County that we think of as traditionally being much younger due to the student population, it'll increase from 10.3% to almost 19% in just a 20-year period. Let's look at the share of population age 15 to 24. So the same 3 time periods that we looked at for age 65 and older. We can see that in some instances, like Columbia County, it remains fairly similar across time. We can see in Dane, it drops by over 2 percentage points, drops in Dodge County, drops in Jefferson County, drops in Marquette County to just 8.3%, and drops in Sauk County to 10.6%. So if we think about engaging youth, and they're declining in the number of individuals that are potentially part of our labor force, both now and into the future. These are individuals that become very, very important. They already were, we all know that, but they become very important going forward for engaging them and making sure that they are part of our communities. And if they do leave, how do we make sure that they come back at some point as well? One additional way to look at this is kind of the replacement rate of individuals perhaps entering the labor force and those individuals exiting the labor force. So 15 to 19 and ages 65 to 69. This is for the 6 counties in South Central Wisconsin. If we go back to 2010, we can see that there were almost 2 people entering the labor force potentially for every person perhaps exiting the labor force. By the year 2025, we essentially reached parity. As many people entering as perhaps exiting the labor force. Very similar trends in 2030. We do see some perhaps improvements on this in 2035 and 2040, but nonetheless, we do not see the gaps that we saw similar to the year 2010. Different industries will be hit in different magnitudes due to the share of their employment base that are of different age groups. This looks at South Central Wisconsin employees age 55 and older by industry sector. This is for the Q2 of 2020, which is the most current data we have. We can see on average across all industry sectors that 23% of employees were age 55 and older, so approaching retirement age, perhaps in the next 10 years or less. We can see that certain industries have a higher share of individuals. So we see educational services, we see manufacturing, we see public administration, transportation and warehousing. We think about demands of the trucking industry and the share of their individuals approaching retirement age. These are all industries that are disproportionately facing perhaps changes to the labor force due to their aging workforce. We look at this in terms of total magnitude. You know, certainly some industries are larger than others in terms of the total number of people they employ. Manufacturing, well, almost 16,000 individuals are age 55 or older in the manufacturing industry sector. Healthcare, we just talked about how healthcare demands will increase going forward as our population ages. It's also going to impact the labor force in healthcare and social assistance, as that is the 2nd largest sector in terms of employees age 55 or older in South Central Wisconsin. And then we can go so on down the line: educational services, retail, trade, public administration. We can also flip this and look at the share of individuals aged 24 and under by industry sector. And we can actually break this down in a little bit more detail if you're interested in terms of age groups under the age of 24. No big surprise that the accommodation, food service industry, retail, trade, and arts, entertainment, recreation have the highest dependence on individuals aged 24 and under. But we also see industries like information. A lot of this has to do with Epic Systems. They are in this industry sector, so they have a large number of employees that are probably between ages of 22 and 24. Overall, we see about 12.2% of individuals are age 24 or under in South Central Wisconsin. But if we look at some of our big employers in terms of total number of employment, we see healthcare and social assistance only 10.5%. And part of this obviously is it takes longer for individuals to get skilled up and educated in some of these industries beyond the age of 24. But we also see transportation warehousing just 10.1%. We can see construction 11.2% under the average. Manufacturing, just 7.7% of individuals are under or age 24 or under in the manufacturing sector in South Central Wisconsin. So I think going forward, one of the opportunities that people have suggested for us increasing the supply of labor and increasing the number of young individuals in our communities is through talent attraction retention efforts. So how do we get people to stay in the state of Wisconsin, and how do we get more people to come to the state of Wisconsin? And I think that this opportunity is certainly there, but it's probably not one that we can rely too heavily on. These are state net migration rates for every single state in the country, going back to 1990 up to the most recent data we have in 2019. If you're above zero, you have more people coming into your state than out of your state. If you're below zero, you have more people leaving your state than coming into your state. You can see Wisconsin has pretty much been consistently close to that line. Some years increasing the number of people coming relative to leaving, and in some years losing people on a net basis. But again, pretty close to zero for the most part. We see our neighboring states of Minnesota, Illinois, just for perspective. We can also see several states that have traditionally attracted a lot of people in terms of migration. So the state of Colorado and the state of Washington. And again, I just want to use those as a couple benchmarks. We can break this down into domestic in-migration rates. So the share of the population that moved in from another state in a given year. One of the things you'll notice is that the state of Wisconsin has traditionally had one of the lowest in-migration rates of any state in the country. Very similar to Minnesota, very similar to Illinois, and again, lower to some of those magnet states like Colorado and Washington. You will see these big spikes in the year 2017. This was due to a change in the processing of the data set we're using here, so I wouldn't put a lot of stock into those, but nonetheless, just keep in mind the relative position of Wisconsin compared to other states. Here's out-migration rate, so the share of the population that left a given state to another state in a given year. And one of the things you'll notice is that our out-migration rate is also one of the lowest in the entire country. It's also lower than the state of Colorado and the state of Washington. Now, how can that be? The reality is that the state of Wisconsin does not have a lot of population churn at all, and that states that attract a lot of people also lose a lot of people. They have a lot of churn. They're dynamic. They have people coming and going all the time. It's just they have more people coming than going. So the reality is that our state is a very sticky state. We have most of our population that is born here and stays here, or goes away and comes back. So when we talk about talent attraction retention, it's not necessarily so much about retention, but it's about attraction. And attraction is not something we've done traditionally well for the last 30 years or so. And again, if we look at overall dynamism in terms of churn, we can see that, again, Wisconsin has one of the lowest rates of population churn due to migration of any state in the country. So again, we are a very static state in that way. The other trend we have to realize is that overall mobility rates are dropping across the board. If We look at mobility rates in terms of different types of movements going back to 1950. We can see that overall movement has declined. It's at the lowest point it's been in 70 years. That's also declined in terms of the individuals moving across state lines or county lines. So again, we see how mobility rates in terms of people moving from state to state or from county to county are very low now. There's very good reasons for this, and we don't have time to go into them all now, but I'm happy to discuss more about them going forward. But what this means is that if we are thinking about talent attraction retention as a means of boosting our overall supply of labor, it is an opportunity, but it's probably not one that's going to have huge gains going forward. So what this means is that we have to look at other strategies in ways to increase the quantity and quality of our labor force. And again, a lot of these pertain directly to youth. Some of them don't. And again, we don't have time to go into all these now. And I know a lot of you are already doing a lot of these. But I would suggest that individuals engaged in workforce development find all of the partnerships they can and develop all the partnerships they can. I know a lot of you have very strong relationships already, but there are many individuals and many groups that are working in workforce development that provide opportunities to help address these issues using all sorts of strategies. Obviously, one that's really important for youth is internships and apprenticeships. The research on the effectiveness of these programs shows that they have very strong outcomes in terms of connecting individuals with employers, a very important strategy for youth going forward, especially given the number of youth that we will have in our labor force going forward. And I guess I'd also encourage youth that if you're not looking at this already, given the number of retirements that you're going to have going forward, think about how you engage your retirees, potential retirees, in terms of knowledge transfer and reverse mentoring. How do you connect individuals that are retiring with youth to make sure that you're not losing all that institutional knowledge and information that they've gained over their time of employment in your business? This can really help improve productivity and increase outcomes in terms of retaining employees. We can also think about how we can invest in youth going forward and think about how we can also increase participation rates among individuals that may face barriers to employment. One that we'll just highlight real quickly here is the demand for childcare and early education. Certainly the pandemic exposed this demand and this need for childcare in a very strong way. It's something that was a challenge before the pandemic, but I think it's, if anything good has come out of the pandemic, it's really emphasized a lot of the barriers that individuals face in terms of engaging in the labor market. These are participation rates for males and females aged 20 to 64. And again, we can see that female participation rates are lower than those of their male counterparts across almost every county here. And again, one of the primary reasons for that is that over time, childcare has disproportionately fallen on female householders. And one of the things we'll see is that if we look at the number of children per prime age female or children under the age of 5, as the number of kids go up in a household, the participation rate among women of prime working age goes down. So this is a fairly strong relationship. In contrast, as the number of children under the age of 5 per prime working age male goes up, participation rates among males go up as well. And again, a lot of this has to do with childcare demands. So if we look at participation rates for females age 16 or with a child age 16 to 17, so individuals that are probably of school age, again, we can see participation rates among females go up. So again, how do we make sure that we have not only effective and numerous childcare establishments per the number of children we have in our region, but also how do we make sure it's cost effective? And we do know that childcare costs, especially in some South Central Wisconsin counties, are extraordinarily high. The other thing to keep in mind here in terms of childcare is that it's not just about getting people into the labor force, and it's not just about babysitting. If we look at the research in terms of return on investment and educational outcomes in early child care education. The outcomes going forward as these children go through the school system and into the labor force are very, very strong. So it's not just about getting women or people into the labor force due to childcare. It's also about how do we make sure we're creating a pipeline of individuals that have been set on a path to success going forward. And that starts at a very young age. One final trend I like to talk about is automation. And we can think about automation in different categories in terms of robotics, in terms of computerization, in terms of artificial intelligence. I just want to focus real briefly on computerization today because that is one that will affect many of our occupations going forward. And a couple points to keep in mind is that investments in automation tend to accelerate after an economic downturn. This isn't just true with the pandemic, but it happened after the Great Recession. It happened after the recession in 2001, and it actually happened back into the 80s as well. So again, we will likely see automation increase as a result of the pandemic. This will influence opportunities for our youth going forward in terms of the types of skills they will need and perhaps the types of jobs that will be available to them. And importantly, I think a lot of people, when they hear automation, they automatically think of automation that's coming to take my job. It will replace my job or replace me. No, what it will do is change the nature of many jobs and create new jobs in many instances, and also influence the types of skills and requirements needed by many occupations in many different industry sectors. So this is based on some research that came out of Oxford back in 2017. And what they did was look at the types of occupations that have a high probability of being automated going forward and that are not subject to these bottlenecks. So computers right now are not very good at perception. They're not very good at creative intelligence, and they're not very good at social intelligence, but they are good at many, many other things. And those abilities for them to perform many skills and many skilled or occupational demands are increasing. So if we look at the probability of different occupations being exposed to computerization, and we look at the distribution of those occupations in the state of Wisconsin, we can see that almost 29% of occupations currently in the state of Wisconsin have a probability of being exposed to computerization of 90% or more. So almost a third of jobs have a very high probability of being influenced by computerization or exposed to computerization going forward. If we look at occupation categories in terms of those that are largest in the state of Wisconsin, and we look at the probability of computerization, we can see that many jobs that are present in large numbers in the state of Wisconsin have a high probability of being exposed to computerization. Unfortunately, many of those jobs also tend to be low average wages. So the size of the circle is the basis on the number of jobs in that occupation. And those with high probabilities tend to have large numbers, and they tend to be lower wage jobs. Industries that will face exposure to computerization: agriculture. We're already seeing robotic milking machines. We're seeing precision agriculture. We're seeing robotic tractors. Retail trade, accommodation food services, manufacturing. Almost 51% of the occupations in manufacturing right now have a 75% or greater probability of being exposed to computerization. And many of those jobs are very prevalent in the manufacturing sector. So if we look at those with probabilities of computerization going forward, team assemblers, laborers and freight stock and material movers, welders, inspectors, sorters, and so on and so forth. Very high probability of increasing the exposure of computerization going forward. And what this means is, I noticed many of you on the call right now are involved in technical education. Getting kids to think about what this might mean for their job going forward and the types of skills they might need to do these occupations in the future. And I know a lot of you are already doing that, but it's something that's not going to go away and will probably accelerate. One final issue that we didn't have time to talk about today is how broadband influences almost everything we talked about today. We did put out a couple reports, just a shameless plug for some of our research in terms of how broadband influences Wisconsin economy, also influences workforce development. And there's a link there to access some of those documents if you have interest going forward. And with that, this is my contact information. Again, I'm more than happy to share the slide deck or answer any questions you may have. And again, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. If there's more information that you are seeking going forward about a individual topic, I'm more than happy to try and answer those questions if I can. With that, thank you.